Have you ever woken in the dead of night, unable to move, while a dark figure loomed at the edge of your bed? For thousands of people across the world, that figure wears a hat, a fedora, a wide-brimmed shadow, or sometimes even a cowboy's hat. He is known only as the Hatman. Accounts of this being stretch back more than a century. Diaries, local newspapers, and whispered stories mention a tall silhouette with a distinct hat, appearing at night and filling entire rooms with fear. In the 1990s, when late-night radio and early internet forums gave ordinary people a place to share their strangest experiences, reports of the Hatman multiplied. Callers who had never met each other described him in almost identical terms. A faceless, featureless figure, taller than any man, darker than any shadow, leaning at the edge of beds, standing in hallways, sometimes gliding forward until the air turned so cold it was hard to breathe. Unlike other shadow figures that vanish when spotted, the Hatman lingers. He waits. He watches. Some say he is nothing more than a hallucination caused by sleep paralysis. Others believe he is something much darker, a parasite that feeds on fear and keeps returning to those it chooses. This is the story of Sarah, and it may change the way you look at the darkness in your room tonight. Sarah was 19, a second-year college student living in a squat red brick dormitory built in the 1930s. The old building carried history in its bones, once a boarding house for railwaymen before being absorbed by the university. Its hallways echoed with the hiss of ancient radiators and the groan of wooden pipes. At night, the yellow light from the corridor slipped through the crack under her door, barely touching the small shoebox of a room she shared with her roommate Jess. On a bitterly cold night in late November, Sarah fell asleep with a book across her chest and a half-empty mug of peppermint tea cooling on the desk beside her bed. The room was quiet except for the occasional tick of the heater. At some point in the night, her eyes snapped open. The neon glow of the alarm clock read 3:12 a.m. At first, nothing seemed wrong, but when she tried to move her hand to push the book aside, her body refused to respond. She strained harder. Nothing. Her arms, her legs, even her chest felt pinned by something invisible. That was when she heard it, the hum. Low and steady, like the buzz of a fluorescent light, but it wasn't coming from the heater or the hallway. It was inside her, as though her bones had been turned into tuning forks. And then she saw the corner. The shadows there seemed darker than they should have been. Her breath caught as the shape separated itself from the blackness. A tall figure, sharp-edged, perfectly still. For a moment she tried to tell herself it was a trick of her tired eyes, but then the detail became undeniable. On its head sat a wide-brimmed hat, tilted forward, casting the place where a face should have been into deeper void. Sarah's heart hammered. The figure glided forward, soundless, as if the floor itself had carried it. Each inch closer made the air grow colder. When it reached her bedside, the weight on her chest grew crushing. She fought to scream, but no sound escaped. The Hatman leaned closer, the brim slicing across her vision, the void of a face hovering inches above her own. The pressure became unbearable. Her eyes blurred. Just when she thought she would suffocate, the figure straightened, drifted backward into the corner, and with a flicker, melted into the shadows. Her body snapped back into motion. She sat up gasping, drenched in sweat. The clock glowed 3:13. She clutched her chest, telling herself over and over it was just sleep paralysis, nothing more. That's what everyone said about experiences like this. The body wakes before the brain. Hallucinations fill the gap. That had to be it. But the certainty of being watched lingered long after the shadows looked normal again. The next day passed like a foggy dream. Sarah told no one what happened, not even Jess. She convinced herself it was a one-time mistake of her body. Stress, too much caffeine, not enough sleep. But when night came again, dread pooled in her stomach. She stayed up late, scrolling her phone, fighting to keep her eyes open until exhaustion dragged her under. When she woke again, the clock read 3:12. Her body was frozen. The hum filled her bones, louder this time. The corner darkened, and there he was, exactly as before. The tall silhouette, the wide-brimmed hat, watching. He glided forward, closer and closer, until the brim eclipsed the ceiling light. The weight on her chest was worse, her ribs aching under the pressure. Her vision blurred to gray. This time, as he leaned closer, she swore she heard something. Not words exactly, but a sound like wind being pulled through a metal pipe, a faint whisper threading past her ear. And then he was gone. She sat up, throat raw, chest heaving. The clock read 3:13, 2 nights in a row. Same time, same figure. She no longer believed it was just sleep paralysis. On the 3rd night, she didn't even try to deny it. She left her desk lamp on, the hall light glowing beneath the door, even tucked her phone under her pillow as if its glow could keep her safe. None of it mattered. At exactly 3:12, Sarah's eyes flew open, her body locked, and the hum filled the room. And in the corner, the hatman was waiting. This time, he did not come alone. Sarah no longer slept easily. Each night she fought to stay awake, and each morning she woke with heavy eyes that made the daylight feel unreal. The thought of closing them again filled her with dread, because she knew what time she would wake if she did. 3 nights in a row the same thing happened. 3 nights at exactly 3:12. Her body locked and her eyes snapped open to the humming in her bones. 3 nights the hatman waited for her. He came closer each time, and the whispers at her ear grew sharper, as though trying to form words. By the 4th night, she had stopped telling herself it was just sleep paralysis. The way he lingered, the way he always arrived at the same time, the way the air itself seemed to shrink when he was near, none of it felt like a dream. She started leaving her phone on record while she slept, desperate to prove something was happening. In the morning, she would play it back, scrolling past hours of silence. But on one recording at exactly 3:12, the phone picked up a faint, almost inaudible hum. She pressed the speaker to her ear and replayed it again and again. It wasn't the radiator. It wasn't her breath. It was the same tone she felt in her bones. She didn't show Jess at first. She was terrified of the look she might get, the awkward silence, the reassurance that she needed to see a doctor. But the fear of keeping it to herself became heavier than the fear of being laughed at. One afternoon, she pressed the phone into Jess's hand. Jess listened, frowned, then laughed nervously and said maybe it was interference. But her laugh was thin, and when she set the phone down, she didn't meet Sarah's eyes. That night, Jess insisted on keeping her desk lamp on, claiming she had work to finish. She didn't. She just stayed awake, watching Sarah, pretending to read. The 3:12, Sarah froze again. Jess swore later that she saw the shadows in the corner ripple, darker than they should have been, as though the room had inhaled. She didn't say this out loud until weeks later. That night, she only whispered Sarah's name over and over, begging her to move, until 3:13 came and Sarah gasped awake. The next day, Sarah went to the library instead of class. She typed "Shadow Man Hat" into the search bar, then "sleep paralysis entity." Then finally, with trembling fingers, the Hatman. The results were endless. Forums filled with terrified posts, people describing exactly what she had seen. Drawings, crude sketches, all the same. A tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, faceless, watching. Some said he had haunted them for years, appearing at turning points in their lives. Others swore he was tied to trauma, loss, or fear, feeding on it, growing stronger the more you believed in him. A few claimed he had followed their families across generations. Sarah's stomach turned cold when she read that. She thought of her grandmother, who used to tell strange stories when Sarah was little. Stories about a man who stood in the doorway at night, watching but never stepping inside. Her grandmother never called him the Hat Man. She had called him the When Man. Presence, not a person. Time, not a name. Sarah had laughed at the story as a child. Now she realized it was never a story. It had been a warning. That night, she set her phone to record again. She positioned it on the dresser, the camera aimed at the bed. She told herself this was the only way to prove it to herself. If she could see it afterward, she would know she wasn't losing her mind. The recording ran all night. Hours of stillness, the faint tick of the heater, the soft sound of breathing. But at 3:12, the screen rippled. Not a glitch, not static, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. The corner of the room grew darker, pixel by pixel, until the shadows pooled together. The shape began to form. A hat brim, faint but undeniable, etched itself in the black. The next morning, Sarah sat frozen, watching the video again and again. She showed Jess this time, and Jess's face went pale. "Delete it," she whispered. "Just delete it." But Sarah didn't. She couldn't, because for the first time, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. Something was coming into her room, something real, and it was only getting stronger. The more Sarah read, the less she wanted to know. The internet was full of theories, but the ones that unsettled her most were the stories of people who claimed the Hatman had followed their bloodlines. Grandparents who saw him as children, parents who woke to him in their 20s, and then the same thing happening again to their sons and daughters. It wasn't just an isolated nightmare. It was something passed down like a curse. That thought clung to her all day, until finally she dialed her grandmother's number. The call connected, and her grandmother's voice, warm and steady, filled the line. They spoke about school, about the weather, about little things, but eventually Sarah forced the question out. "Grandma, have you ever seen someone at night? Someone in a hat?" The silence that followed was heavy. For a moment, Sarah thought the line had gone dead. Then her grandmother sighed. "I was hoping you'd never ask me that," she said softly. "Yes, I've seen him." Sarah's chest tightened. Her grandmother explained how, as a girl, she would wake in her farmhouse bedroom to find a tall man in the doorway, brimmed hat shadowing his face. He never came closer. He only stood and watched. When she tried to cry out, no sound came. When she tried to move, her body stayed locked. It happened many times, always at the same hour of the night. "I called him the when man," her grandmother whispered, "because he is not really a who. He is a when. He arrives at certain times, when you're weakest, when you're afraid, when something is changing. He feeds on it." Sarah asked how long it lasted. "For me," her grandmother said, "until I stopped giving him fear, until I refused to be his meal. But it took years." The words made Sarah shiver. That night, she didn't bother setting her phone to record. She already knew what was coming. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the clock to turn. Her heart hammered faster as the digits flipped to 312. The hum filled her bones. Her body locked, and the corner grew darker. The Hat Man glided forward as he always did. But this time, Sarah tried something different. Instead of fighting to scream or thrash, she stared back into the void of his face. Every instinct in her screamed to look away, to collapse into terror, but she remembered her grandmother's words. "Don't feed him." The weight pressed down, her ribs groaning under it, but she forced her mind to stay calm. She focused on her breath, slow and steady. For a moment, it seemed to work. The Hat Man hesitated, his brim tilting as if confused. Then he leaned closer than ever before. So close she felt his cold seep into her skin. And this time, the whisper was clearer. She couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't random noise. It was a voice, speaking directly to her ear. Her chest clenched with panic, and just like that, he had what he wanted. The pressure grew unbearable until her vision blackened. At 3:13, it stopped. He melted back into the shadows, leaving her gasping for breath. Sarah realized then that this wasn't going to end easily. She wasn't just seeing the Hat Man. He had chosen her, and he wasn't going to let go. The next day, Sarah was exhausted, her body dragging like it had run a marathon in her sleep. She didn't tell Jess the details of what happened, only that it was bad again. Jess urged her to see the campus doctor, but Sarah knew no medication could solve this. What she was dealing with wasn't in her head. She remembered her grandmother's advice. Don't give him fear. But how do you not fear something that arrives like clockwork every night, steals your breath, and whispers in your ear? Sarah tried everything she could think of. She sprinkled salt along the threshold of the door because she'd read once that spirits get trapped, counting grains. She slipped an old iron nail into her pillowcase, remembering a story about how iron repels dark things. She even muttered prayers she hadn't said since childhood, each word tasting foreign on her tongue. None of it worked. At 3:12, the humming came, The corner darkened. The Hatman stepped out of the shadows and glided to her bed. Salt didn't stop him. Iron didn't slow him. Words dissolved in the air like smoke. But something was different. This time, when he leaned over her, she saw movement in the darkness behind him. Another shape, smaller, narrower. A second shadow figure, faceless and silent, standing just inside the corner. And for the first time, she understood the terrible truth. The Hatman wasn't alone. He was bringing others. The next morning, Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through her phone. She found forums where people described the same thing. He comes first, one post read. But after a while, others follow. Sometimes they crawl. Sometimes they stand in the corners. They don't all wear hats, but they come with him. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, but the words stayed with her like splinters under the skin. That evening, she didn't even try to sleep. She sat up at her desk, staring at the glowing face of her alarm clock, daring it to tick forward. At 3:12, the hum started again, but this time she was fully awake. She wasn't paralyzed. She could move, and that terrified her more. She looked up slowly toward the corner, praying the shadows would stay still. They didn't. The Hatman unfolded from them, tall and silent, his hat brim cutting across the glow of the desk lamp. He didn't need her to be paralyzed anymore. He didn't need the dream state. He was crossing into her waking life. Sarah scrambled to her feet, backing toward the door. Jess stirred in her bunk, half asleep, mumbling, "What's wrong?" But Sarah couldn't answer. The Hatman glided closer, each step silent, the air freezing around him. She bolted for the light switch and snapped it on. The room flooded with brightness, harsh and unforgiving. The Hatman was gone. Jess sat up, hair wild, eyes wide. "What the hell, Sarah?" Sarah couldn't speak. She could only point at the corner. From then on, light became her only safety. She kept lamps burning, the overhead bulb blazing, even a flashlight clutched in her hand under the covers. But she knew deep down that light wasn't going to save her. It only delayed him, because shadows exist even in the brightest rooms. And the Hatman was patient. Over the following week, Sarah started to see him in places she shouldn't. A reflection in a darkened window when she walked across campus at night. A flicker in the corner of her eye during lectures, as though someone tall stood in the back of the room. Once, she swore she saw him under a streetlight, hat tilted, body darker than the night itself. Yet when a car passed, he was gone. The Hatman was no longer just a visitor in her sleep. He was following her into her days. Sarah's life started to unravel in small, undeniable ways. She stopped attending morning classes because she couldn't sleep until dawn. Her essays went unwritten. Coffee became her only food group. Jess, once patient, grew worried and frustrated, watching her roommate transform into a pale, jumpy version of herself. "You need help?" Jess whispered one night, after finding Sarah curled in the corner of the room with every light burning. "This thing, whatever it is, it's in your head." But Sarah knew better. Shadows in her head couldn't hum in her bones. Hallucinations didn't show up on camera, and dreams didn't bleed into the day. One evening, she went to the campus archives. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she needed answers. The basement smelled of dust and paper, the air too still. An old librarian with round glasses brought her bound volumes of the local paper, their pages thin as onion skin. She turned them carefully, scanning for anything: fires, deaths, strange reports. And then she found it. A headline from 1932. "Boarding house blaze claims life of night watchman." The article described how a small fire had broken out in the building that now served as her dorm. The watchman on duty was found dead in the smoke, his body discovered near the stairwell. The piece noted one odd detail. Witnesses recall the man always wore his dark hat, even indoors, even at night. Sarah's stomach dropped. Could that be him? The Hatman wasn't supposed to be a ghost. But what if he was something worse, born of tragedy, but turned into something far darker over the decades? She shoved the volume away, hands trembling. That night, she called her grandmother again. The old woman listened quietly, And when Sarah described the newspaper clipping, her voice cracked. "Yes," she whispered. "I know of that fire. He came to me soon after. He came to my sister, too. This isn't just yours to carry, Sarah. He's been circling us for generations." Sarah pressed the phone harder to her ear. "How do I stop him?" "You can't stop him," her grandmother said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "But you can starve him. He feeds on fear. He thrives when you give it to him. If you deny him that, sometimes he weakens. But you must be strong. Stronger than I ever was." Sarah hung up shaking. She wanted to believe her grandmother, but it was impossible not to fear the Hatman. How could she deny him when every cell in her body screamed in terror each time his brim appeared? Over the next few nights she tried. She forced herself to stay calm when the hum began. She stared directly into the shadow where his face should have been. She told herself over and over, "You don't scare me. You don't scare me." And sometimes, for a moment, it seemed to work. The Hatman would pause, tilting his head, almost puzzled. The pressure would lighten, and he would step back into the dark. But other times, he pushed harder. The weight on her chest grew so crushing she thought her ribs would snap. Once she woke with bruises spreading across her skin, blue and purple fingerprints that no one could explain. Jess saw them one morning and gasped, "Sarah, what the hell is happening to you?" Sarah couldn't answer. She only whispered, "He's stronger now." Jess didn't sleep in the room after that. She begged Sarah to go home, to take a break, to tell someone. But Sarah stayed. She knew the Hatman wasn't bound to the dorm. He was bound to her. And one night, when she woke at 3:12, she realized the hum was louder than ever before. Louder than the radiator, louder than her heartbeat. And she wasn't alone with him anymore. The other shadows were moving. Sarah knew something had changed the moment she opened her eyes that night. The hum wasn't just inside her bones anymore. It filled the room, vibrating the air like a swarm of invisible wires strung too tight. The clock read 3:12. She couldn't move, but she didn't need to look to know he was already there. The Hatman stepped from the corner, brim cutting across the glow of her lamp. But this time he wasn't alone. The shadows behind him rippled and split into shapes. Thin figures, faceless and silent, crawling along the walls like smoke given form. They didn't come close, not yet. They only lingered at the edges, watching, as if they were waiting for his signal. Sarah's chest locked under the weight, her breath scraping thin. Every instinct screamed at her to collapse into terror, to give in. But her grandmother's words echoed in her head. Starve him. Fear was what he wanted. Fear was the feast. She forced herself to breathe. Slow, steady. Her heart wanted to tear through her ribs, but she made herself stare directly into the void of his face. She whispered in her mind, over and over, "You don't own me. You don't scare me." The Hatman tilted his head, brim dipping slightly. For the first time, his stillness seemed uncertain. The shadows behind him quivered, restless, as though they didn't know whether to advance or retreat. Then he leaned forward, closer than ever, brim almost brushing her forehead. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A voice without air, without breath. She couldn't understand the words, but she knew the intent. "You are mine." Her chest screamed under the pressure. Her vision blurred to white. In that final desperate moment, Sarah did something she hadn't done since childhood. She prayed. Not to anyone specific, not to anything she understood, but to whatever might be listening. "Please, please, not like this." And then it broke. The weight lifted. The hum shattered like glass. The Hatman snapped upright, and the shadows recoiled from the walls as if pulled by invisible strings. For a heartbeat, the room was filled with silence so deep it felt like the world itself had stopped. And then, as if retreating into some invisible door, they were gone. The clock clicked to 3:13. Sarah bolted upright, gasping, the taste of salt and blood in her mouth where she'd bitten her lip. The lamp still burned. Jess stirred in her bunk, mumbling in her sleep, unaware that the room had just been a battlefield. For the first time in weeks, Sarah made it to dawn without seeing him again. But it wasn't victory. Not really. She knew it in her bones. The Hatman hadn't been defeated. He had only stepped back, waiting. The days that followed felt lighter, but not safe. She still caught glimpses, reflections in darkened windows, a shape at the end of a hallway, the hum faint in the back of her skull when she was tired. She never forgot her grandmother's warning. He is not a who, he is a when. And one night, months later, when life almost felt normal again, Sarah woke from a deep sleep to find her clock blinking. The numbers glowed in the darkness. 3:12 a.m. The hum returned, and in the corner the Hatman was waiting. Sarah sat in silence long after the hum had vanished. The weight on her chest was gone, but the memory of it lingered like bruises on her ribs. She knew now that the Hatman wasn't just a dream, wasn't just sleep paralysis, he was real. And worse, he was tied to her family like a chain that stretched back generations. The next morning, Sarah packed a small bag and left campus without telling Jess. She boarded a bus to her grandmother's house, the one place she thought might still hold answers. When she arrived, her grandmother was waiting at the door, eyes already weary, as if she had known this day would come. Together they went into the attic, where the dust smelled of age and secrets. Her grandmother opened an old cedar chest and pulled out a box wrapped in cloth. Inside lay a bundle of iron keys, a Bible with cracked leather, and a folded newspaper clipping from 1932, the same fire Sarah had discovered in the archives. Her grandmother pressed one of the keys into Sarah's hand. "This was given to me when he came for me. It won't destroy him, nothing can, but it will keep him at the threshold. As long as you carry it, he cannot cross uninvited." That night, Sarah slept in the small upstairs room of her grandmother's house. At 3:12, the hum returned, vibrating the air. The Hatman appeared in the corner, brim low, shoulders broad. But when he tried to step forward, his form shuddered, as though an invisible wall had risen before him. The iron key burned cold in Sarah's palm, glowing faintly in the dark. For the first time, she watched him retreat. Slowly, reluctantly, the Hatman melted back into the shadows. The hum faded, and the room was hers again. Sarah never saw him in her dreams after that night. She carried the key with her always, tucked in her pocket, heavy against her skin. Sometimes, when she passed dark windows or empty hallways, she still caught flickers of movement, hints that he was watching, waiting. But he never came close. And though she had found a way to keep him at bay, Sarah knew the truth. The Hatman does not disappear. He only moves on, waiting for the next time, waiting for the next person. So if you ever wake in the dead of night, unable to move, with a hum crawling through your bones, check the corner of your room. If you see the outline of a hat, pray you have something to keep him out. Because once he chooses you, he never truly leaves.